Okay, so tonight's shiur, we're continuing our study of the Responsa of Hakham Ovadiah Yosef Z. Actually, his Shloshim was today, the 30 days already of his passing. And I thought my first thought was that it would be appropriate to focus on something pertaining to Avelut, to mourning, since we're marking the 30 days of his P'tirah, of his passing. But in the course of searching for a relevant topic about mourning that also might have a broader relevance, so my eye was caught by this topic, this subtopic, and in particular, as we're going to see, it's very intriguing on a number of levels, as many of his teshuvot are. We learned last week some of his progressive ideas. We're going to see here a different side of him, and I want to stress that we're actually going to end up contrasting two teshuvot, a shorter responsa. That's why instead of different sources like I gave you last time, a responsa from Rav Moshe Feinstein last time, and we had a Talmudic passage, this time we're actually going to focus on two responsa that Hakham Ovadiah authored, that on the surface almost seem to contradict one another ever so slightly. But through the contradiction, you see what he's trying to accomplish with these teshuvot, which is really something remarkable. So it's at the bottom of the first page. We're more or less going to follow chronological order, but at a certain point, we're going to skip ahead and then come back. So it says Siman Samech on the bottom. It says She'ela Migir Tzedek. This was a question posed to me by a righteous convert. It says, Ha'im mutar. Now remember, these are the teshuvot from Yehave Daat. Yehave Daat was the compilation of shorter responsa that he gave, and it's all relative, but his more extensive responsa are on the enormous side, with voluminous citations of various sources. Here, these are the more compact and user-friendly teshuvot. They're also written in a little bit easier language. These were the ones that he used to give in his radio show in Israel. So the question was, Im mutar lo litpalel al aviv hanochri hashochev al eretz divai. So he says, is it permitted for a convert to pray for his father who's sick? His father's ill. In other words, there's a sense that when somebody converts, they cut off their contact with their previous family. So am I supposed to be praying for him? Should I pray that God send His word and heal my father? And if he passes away, can I say kaddish for him? Now, one can imagine that if he or she were to ask a contemporary rabbi, you might get a variety of answers to this question, particularly the last one about kaddish. People are very sensitive about saying kaddish and for whom kaddish can be said. And as we're going to see, he gives a fascinating answer to both of these questions. But what's even more fascinating than the final response or the final conclusion is the way that he gets there and following him along with the process by which he reaches the destination that he's eventually going to reach. So let's enjoy the journey, not just run to the end of the discussion. Because one might say, well, of course you can pray for whatever you want. I mean, who's telling you not to pray? Who's telling you not to say kaddish? But that's another issue. But if you were to ask, I did a little search, and I found that this responsum of Hakham Ovadiah is the only text cited about this question by both Ashkenazic and Sephardic poskim. I didn't find anybody else quoted on this topic, except the one other responsum that he quotes at the end. Aside from that, no other contemporary rabbi has really given a definitive ruling on this. They all cite him. Some of them cite him and take and demur from it and have a more conservative answer, and some endorse it. So what we're going to see. So let's see how he starts out. He dissects the problem. Okay? He dissects the problem. So he says like this, Katav b'shulchan aruch yored de'ah. And we will define each one of his steps as we go along. What is he doing in this part of the responsum? Okay? Two questions. Remember, can I pray for him to get better? And after he's gone, can I say the kaddish? So first he's going to deal with, we say that the sign of the chacham is, he's oneh al rishon, right? He responds to the first thing first. So it says in the Shulchan Aruch, in the section Yoreh De'ah, Shulchan Aruch is the code of Jewish law that was written in the 16th century by Rav Yosef Karo. Ovdei avodah zara asur lahatzilam im natu lamut. Okay? it says in the Shulchan Aruch that if you see an idolater, you're not supposed to save him. If he's going to die, you don't save him. Even if you're paid money, you shouldn't be his doctor. If not for the fact that you have to protect Jewish people from the harmful consequences of that. In other words, if people were to know that a Jewish doctor is not going to treat a non-Jewish patient, there are going to be pogroms, there's going to be all kinds of anti-Semitism, forget about it. We won't survive. So we have to do it. That's what the Shulchan Aruch says. Now, if you look at it in context, if you look at where Maimonides brings these halachot, look where the Rambam brings them, he puts it in a different kind of a framework. He speaks about how the reason why we don't help them is because, first of all, they're trying to convert us all the time, and second of all, they're killing us all the time. So the question of the applicability of this halakha to modern times is a little bit up in the air, let's say, in most societies today, thankfully. But in its context, it's understood that these Ovdei Kochavim are not just people who have different theological opinions than the Jews. It's not that we're out to get them. It's that these were people who are really enemies of the Jews, both spiritually and physically. They would try to tear down and destroy the Jewish people, either by proselytizing or through actual physical attack. So we have to understand the social context. And we obviously live today in a substantially different context, very thankfully. In most societies, I should say. And therefore, we see this halakha and we say, wow, that's very harsh. How could you not save somebody who's dying? But in a situation where this person would gladly take a knife and stab you in the back tomorrow, it might be different. So, in any case, he says not to heal an idolater. So let's start with that principle. What's the question? The first question Hakham Ovadiah is going to deal with is, wait a second. Okay, we're not allowed to heal an idolater. But let's parse this. Okay? What is heal? Am I really healing the person if I pray to God? No, God is healing them. I'm not the doctor. Right? I'm not a doctor, but I play one on TV. Right? I'm not a doctor at all. I'm talking to God. God will decide. Number one. Number two, is he really an idolater or not? So these two issues are going to be priority one. Let's get rid of this problem first, is what Rav Ovadiah is going to do. So what does he do with it? He says, and the great Gaon, the Knesset HaGdolah, which was one of the later authorities, rabbinic authorities. By later, we mean after the 16th century. When we talk about Achronim, that's what we're talking about, 16th century and later. Well, first of all, the Rambam himself was a doctor for Arabs and for Muslims. So clearly he didn't think that Muslims were not allowed to be healed even for money, because he did it himself professionally. Because according to Maimonides, Muslims are not, Islam is not an idolatrous religion. That's for sure. There are no idols in Islam. We know that. And if you have somebody who is not an idolater, meaning that he doesn't worship images of any sort, which certainly Islam qualifies for not worshiping images, you are allowed to heal him afilu b'chinam, even for free. Even though there's no concern about fallout, political fallout, anti-Semitism. So step number one, right? Ulefi zeh, this is what I underlined. So there's no question if the parents are Muslim. So in other words, he's starting from the easy things first. So the easy thing first is, okay, we have this restriction that you're not supposed to heal idolaters. Fine. First of all, if he's a Muslim, he's not an idolater. And living in Israel in the Middle East, there's a good chance that if you're a convert, maybe you came from a Muslim family, or there's at least a possibility.
But there aren't that many Muslims that convert, actually.
Yeah, well, but he's growing up in a society where there are not that many Christians. So he's entertaining that as the first possibility. It's true that there are probably not that many that convert today. That's probably true. In any case, he says that that's not even a question. Kevan she'enam ovdei avodah zarah, v'chen mitpe'er bekesef mishneh, u'lechora yesh makom lomar, she'afilu im horav notzrim. So here's where he comes to the second step. So he says, I know what you're thinking. Not every convert came from an Islamic background. In fact, probably most of them did not. They probably came from a Christian background of some sort. So what do we do with the notzrim? Notzrim, a notzri comes from the word natzeret, a Nazarene. Okay, it means a Christian. So what is a notzrim? Shemishatfim shem shamayim v'davar acher en dinam ka'ovdei avodah zarah. Now I want you to keep this in your mind, tucked in a fold of one of the synapses in there, because we're going to come back to this, okay? You're going to see that depending on the case, he chooses which side of this issue he wants to land on, okay? But for now he's saying, well, are Christians really idol worshippers? That's the question. We're saying Islam for sure. They don't have any images. They're more strict about images than Jews. We know they're definitely not of the Avodah Zarah. Forget that. What about Christians? Well, they're mishatfim shem shamayim b'davar acher. What does that mean? That's a concept that, we have a little bit of leeway. Why? Because it's not like this person is coming and saying, I believe in Zeus. What does the Christian say? I believe in God the Father, and I also added on, two other things. If they believe in the Trinity, I also believe in the Holy Ghost, and I also believe in Jesus. Okay, so they're adding on. That's one way to conceive of Christianity. Now, many theologians of Christianity will tell you that's not true. Right? They'll tell you that's not really what we're doing. No, we have a different concept of God. It's really a different concept of God. It's unity and Trinity that are indivisible in some kind of a mystic way that we can't really comprehend. And they'll say that this is not really an accurate depiction of what most Christian theologians will tell you Christianity teaches. However, looking at it from the outside, we can say, well, when they read our Tanakh and they talk about God, they recognize there's a God. They have they add some elements to the concept of God that we don't have. Okay, they believe in a Trinity instead of a unity. But they recognize our God, that if they see a Jew worshiping God, they believe we're worshiping God, we're just missing something. Okay, so that's one way to look at Christianity. Now, I would argue, and we can ask a professional Christian theologian about that. I would hypothesize, speculate that most Christian theologians would not agree with this characterization of Christianity. However, from a halachic standpoint, we need to understand what we're dealing with. Does a Christian recognize our God as a God? Yes, for sure. For sure, we just have an incomplete picture of God according to them. So one way to look at that religion is that they have our God plus extra. Plus extra. That's called mishatfim shem shamayim. They partner the name of God with another thing, v'davar acher. So he says, and it's possible to say in dinamka of the avodah zarah that we don't consider that idolatry, because at least they're hitting the mark for part of it. Okay, it's not like they're worshiping the Greek pantheon of Greek gods or something like that. He says, "Lefi ma shekatvu atosafot Sanhedrin shebnei Noach lo huzaru ala shituf," because there are some who say, as is brought in the Tosafot, and according to one interpretation, that bnei Noach, which are the Noachites and the Gentiles, they're not commanded on shituf. Meaning to say, as long as the Gentile acknowledges the real God, if they want to have some subsidiary gods thrown in, we don't care about that, as long as they recognize the real God. Okay, they want to add some extra components, that's not so bad, according to one opinion. So he says, so we could find leeway. Now notice what he's doing. He's starting out looking for some way to get around it. From flexibility. Already, he started out looking. So he's yeah, right. So he's trying to find a way. So he says, well, if they're Muslims, for sure. If they're Christians, okay, it's a little bit harder to get around the Christianity is not idolatry. It's much harder because they do have a physical image of their God, and they bow to icons and so on.
Isn't that idolatry?
Yeah, you would think so. So he's saying, is the religion in its totality characterized as idolatry? He says there are some opinions who might argue no, because they do recognize also our God. Right? So the recognition of our God is part of it, plus extra frills that they put in. That's one way to look at it. So he says, "V'chen katav harosham, v'chen pasak harama b'hagah b'orach hayim, shelo huzaru b'nei Noach ala shituf." So he says that there are some who have concluded, like the Rama, who was Rav Moshe Isserles, was the chief Ashkenazic posek in Poland. At the same time that the Shulchan Aruch was written in the 16th century, just about the same period of time, who ruled that, we're not going to treat the Christians as real full-fledged idolaters. Why? Now we're going to see. So step one is, maybe we don't treat them as full-fledged idolaters because their theology is not pure idolatry. It's not pure idolatry. It's got like a piece of the truth in there. But there's another reason he's going to give in a second. He says, "V'hen emet shehad Noda b'Yehuda tanina." He says that the Noda b'Yehuda, who was a later Acharon and very, very famous, Rav Yechezkel Landau, very, very famous Acharon, came out against this. Katav umayde margela be'umayde inshi she'en b'Noach mosrim ala shituf cha'utu b'yadam. He said it's not true that they're allowed to believe in the Trinity. It's not true. Absolutely not. ויצא להם הדבר זה ממה שכתב הרמ"א בסימן קנ"ו, ובאמת שאין הכוונה כן, אלא לומר שכאשר הגוי נשבע בעבודה זרה עם שיתוף שם שמיים, ואין אומר אלי אתה, אין הוא מוזר על כך עיין שם. In other words, so there was an argument, וכיוצא בזה כתב, etc. So he quotes all kinds of different sources to back this up, that it's not that they're not allowed to believe in, it's not that they're allowed to believe in the Trinity, but there's a whole other issue, which was that according to halacha, it's a problem to have an idolater as your business partner. Why? Because what happens with almost every business partner? You have a dispute, right? And then you come to the court and they say, would you please put your hand on the Bible and swear that you are going to tell the truth and the whole truth and nothing but the truth? And this guy raises his hand and says, I swear to Jesus, or I swear to Zeus. Right? So what does it say? So you're not allowed to be a partner because you're going to cause him, at some point you're going to have to cause him to acknowledge his God. So it says, well, there we can be lenient because all the non-Jew when he comes to the court is going to say is, so help me God. He's not going to specify his theology. So that, he's not going to necessarily mention his God. So that's okay. But that doesn't mean that from an absolute standpoint, we don't look at the religion as an idolatrous religion. We may very well look at it as an idolatrous religion. And then he goes on to quote some sources, as we switch over to the next page, that argue that no, really, Trinitarian belief is not idolatry. That everything that they have today is just called shituf, combination. It has a true element to it. That they consider God the God of gods. In other words, there's an idea that there's the Father in Christianity. So they have an idea of one God, and then tacked onto that are some other components. So therefore we have a little bit of wiggle room. And so on. He quotes other things. Now look at the next underline that I did. So therefore he says, now according to this line of thinking, just like we don't have to treat them as idolaters for other reasons, we wouldn't have to treat it as idolatry for this. And we could be a doctor for somebody who was Christian, and we could pray for somebody who's Christian, and it's no problem at all, because we're not really considering an idolatry. So what is he holding right now? If it were really idolatry, in other words, if your father believes in actual idolatry and he's bowing to statues somewhere, then forget it. You wouldn't be allowed to. But because Christianity, we can say maybe it's kind of a monotheism, and they believe that they're monotheistic. Okay? So therefore we can have some wiggle room.
But among them, aren't there some Christianity groups that are more pagan? Or
yes, for sure.
So it's not...
Yeah, I mean, like Mormons are much more idolatrous than, let's say, Jehovah's Witnesses are pure monotheistic. They're not, Jehovah's Witnesses don't believe in the Trinity. So they're totally monotheistic. Mormons don't believe in a unity. They believe that there are three different persons and that they all work together. They have a board of directors instead of one God. So they are actually classified as, if you look up they're listed under polytheistic religions because they actually don't believe in one God. They believe in three. So there's a range. And now, of course, most mainstream Christians will say that Mormons are not really Christians anyway. I don't want to get into too much Christian theology. The point is, there's definitely a range. There's a range.
All Christians believe in the Trinity? I didn't know.
Some form of it.
No.
I mean, except for there are Unitarians and there's Jehovah's Witnesses, but they're considered heretical. I mean, the mainstream Christianity, everybody does. There are some fringe groups to either extreme that believe something different, but the mainstream groups, they all consider those heretics. So v'ayin b'beit Yosef yorei de'ah al ma shekatav atur sh'Rashbam b'shem Rashi katav. Now here's another approach. So far he tried it on the theological end. Theologically, maybe because they consider themselves monotheists and they do believe in the Father. He says, Shebazman hazeh. Now, this is a little easier to understand. The Mishnah in the tractate of Avodah Zarah says that you're not allowed to do business with idolaters on their holidays. What was the reason? Because if they made a really good sale, they're going to go right into their temple of idolatry and be thanking the Lord, whatever their Lord is, right? Thanking their God. So you're going to be enriching their idolatry. You're going to be mechazek. You're going to me'oded. You're going to strengthen and encourage their idolatry through giving them a good deal. You don't want to do that. So therefore you shouldn't deal with them. And even if you come to collect a debt, they're going to feel relieved that they were able to pay off their debts. So you shouldn't even come collect money from them. So Rashi said, you can go to the store on an idolatrous holiday. What's the reason? Because nowadays, think about it, even in Rashi's time, they already weren't so religious. Right? They weren't so religious. People weren't so religious that they immediately ran to their God if they made a good deal. So he said, listen, they're not so strong in their religion. Even in the Talmud it says the idolaters in Babylonia, they're not adukim. They're not very, what we would call frum, right? They're not so religious like the idolaters in Israel. The idolaters in Eretz Yisrael were more, and that's interesting because even today that's true. Right? Like, you see that the people who live in Israel, there's more of a religious spirit there. So even the other religions are a little more religious than they are outside. So that's what Rashi said even in his time. And this is very true of Americans. And nowadays, honestly, most Europeans too. That it's minhag avotehem bidehem. Why does the average American celebrate Christmas? They don't care about religion. They've never been in a church. They might not even go to a church even once a year. Not even twice a year. What?
Only on Christmas.
Right. Only, or maybe not at all. Right? They might have no connection at all, but they still have a tree, and they still get together with their family, and they still say Merry Christmas. It doesn't mean anything to them religiously. It's what we call minhag avotehem bidehem. It is just a custom that they've carried down. Now, unfortunately, that's also true for most Jews. But it doesn't matter. We don't care about that. We're only concerned about the idolatry, right? But the fact is, if you walk into Bloomingdale's they're probably not open on December 25th. But if you walk into a store that it does happen to be open to Starbucks is open, part of the day. Wherever you go that might be open, supermarket, those people wishing you whatever, they're not so religious. It's just their custom, it's their culture. Just like an average Jew that sits down to a Pesach Seder, he's not thinking, wow, God redeemed my ancestors from Egypt, and it's for real, and He gave me the mitzvot to keep. He's not thinking about any of that stuff. It's just that every year he comes to a Passover Seder, eats a matzah, drinks some wine, and he goes, oh, that's it. So it's the same thing with most people, and it's become, even more so and more secularized over time. So even in the time of Rashi, which we're talking about, 800 years ago or more, it was already like that, and even in the times of the Talmud it was already like that, that most people just go through the motions. They're not so religious that we should assume that if you're going to... Now, if your neighbor happens to be a priest or minister, okay, maybe that's a different story. And he's selling something out of his garage, maybe that's a different story. But the average person, no. So then, V'chen Pasak Maran b'Shulchan Aruch, this is what the Shulchan Aruch itself says, they don't even know their own religion, let alone practice it. And therefore, therefore, even on their holidays, there's not much of a concern that you're contributing to anything more than their bank account, that they're going to go and buy presents for their family, there's nothing wrong with that. Okay, they're not going to go invest it in their church or in their worship. Now he gets into somewhat of a detail here that there's a halacha about wine produced by Gentiles. And there's a distinction made about wine produced by Muslims versus wine produced by Christians and all that. So he says, well, you see that sometimes we do treat them differently. We distinguish between the two. We're not going to get into that, but skip down to the next underline. He says, Ve'ech sheyeh, whatever way it is, okay? Which is not a very common turn of phrase in a responsa. Okay? Ech sheyeh means I don't want to deal with this right now. But ech sheyeh, however it is, yesh lomar shedavka lerapot hanotzrim shoseh maaseh biyadayim. Now he comes to a whole other thing. Okay, you know what? Ech sheyeh, let's say they're idolaters. Okay, you got me. We make a distinction with regard to wine made by Christians versus Muslims. Fine, let's say they're idolaters. Fine. He says that's only when you're being an actual doctor. You're going to heal the idolater. But here, When you're praying, you're not helping the idolater, you're talking to God. If God decides that this guy is not deserving of healing, so he's going to decide. God is going to do whatever he wants. Says, therefore, we don't restrict people's praying. You pray for whoever you want. Because you're not helping the person or hurting the person. You're talking to God. God is going to decide in the end. You think you're so important that just because you asked for it, God is going to do it? I wish it were so easy. Okay? It's not that easy even when you're praying for somebody who is a great tzaddik and pious person. It doesn't work so simply. So certainly, somebody who's just a regular idolater, it's not going to work so simply. God is going to make his decision. And therefore he says, certainly if a non-Jew approaches you and say, please pray for me, which happens sometimes. People who know that you are religious, that you go to synagogue, that you pray frequently, they come to you and they say, please, I'm not a religious person, but I'd really appreciate if you say a prayer for me. He says, absolutely. This person's coming to you with faith in God. They're saying, please, as a Jew, would you please pray for me? So that's a faith that says, that he knows that God has the power to heal him, and you should certainly pray for him. So he makes two moves here. First he's giving the author of the Responsa. This is Hakham Ovadiah Yosef. So this is all him speaking. This is him speaking. I wish I could have written this. He's quoting the sources to us from in his Responsa. So this is a letter. This is his answer. And in his answer he quotes sources. And the first attempt is to try to say, well, maybe they're not idolaters at all. He says, and even if you're going to argue with me and say, no, that's not really true, they really are idolaters, fine. But you're not asking me, can I go and perform surgical procedures on this guy? You're asking, which by the way, anyway would be okay, because we know in our society that would cause anti-Semitism, so therefore we're allowed to heal anybody who comes to be healed. But let's put all that aside and say, he's a complete idolater, but what am I doing? I'm talking to God. I'm not doing anything directly. And you're going to tell me, then God is not allowed to heal. God does whatever he wants. I'm not going to tell God what the halacha is, what he has to do. Right? This responsa is not for God. And so therefore, he concludes you can pray for whatever you want and for whomever you want, because ultimately it's God's decision. It's not your action.
Now, doesn't that totally overwhelm all the other argument? I mean, he could have left the other out almost.
What he always does is, what he wants to do is, now you see here, he clearly, you can get a sense from the beginning usually in his tshuvot. Not always. Sometimes he purposely stacks the deck on the other side first, and then flips it around. But here he's not doing that. Here he's making a very concerted effort to move in a specific direction. So
it really doesn't matter what the person's beliefs is, because it's in the hand of God.
Right. That answer in a way pushes away all of the other answers, right? But why? So why then does Hakham Ovadiah give more than one answer? Because when you're writing a responsa, you have to realize, who are you writing it for? You're writing it for the person who asked the question. But the person who asked the question doesn't understand any of these sources anyway most of the time. Otherwise they wouldn't need to be asking you. Right? So therefore what's the reason? It's for scholars who are going to read this, or for students like us who are trying to understand the thought process. And you might come to this and have said, well, the second answer, I don't really believe the second argument doesn't carry that much weight with me, but the first one does. Or the first one carries weight with me, but the second one doesn't. So he wants to give you options that open the door to different thought processes. A rabbi might come along and say, well, that argument that you are that you're not really doing anything, I don't buy that argument, because you are doing something. You're trying to take your merit and transfer it to this person and do something for them. So in other words, somebody could argue. So he says, okay, so then I have the other answer. So he's trying to cover his bases. But what I wanted to show you before we go to the next part of this response is, jump ahead 1, 2, 3 pages. The back of the 4th page of the packet is another responsum. Now the first one that we read was Samech from volume Vav. So it was responsum 60 in volume 6. This is from volume 4 of Yehave Daat, responsum number 45, Memhe. What's the question here? And this is amazing. Now keep in mind what he just did, right? What did he just argue? Well, it's not really idolatry because this and that. Okay. What was the question here? Ha'im mutar liyehudi levaker b'chnesya shel notzrim. Are you allowed to go in a church? Okay. And what's he going to say here? All of a sudden he forgot about all the other nice stuff that he just said in the other responsa. Okay, let's see what he says. B'masechet avodah zarah mivoar. It says in Masechet Avodah Zarah, tractate of idolatry, sheyesh isur afilu litkarev lepetach habayit shel avodah zarah. You're not even allowed to go near the door of the house of idolatry. Shene'emar al tikrav al petach betah. It says in Mishnah, don't go near the house of the adulterous woman, which is a metaphor used there for the idolatry that's going to beckon to you. V'chen katvu tosafot sham v'Rambam b'perush Mishnah. The Rambam talks about even living in a city that we shouldn't even live in a city that has an idolatrous shrine in it, but we have no choice today because every city has all kinds of houses of worship, so we have no choice. And it's oive for us that we have no choice. That's what he said. He doesn't say oive, but he says we have no choice. We're living in the galut. We're anusim. Okay, we're forced. We have no choice.
So in Israel, there were Hasidic groups that wouldn't come to Yerushalayim because there's so many.
Because there's a church there.
They lived in Tel Aviv.
Mm-hmm. Right, so that's what the Rambam is saying. He's saying if you had a choice to live in a place completely without any idolatrous places of worship, that would be great. But there's no such thing today. He says, anusim. We have no choice. They're everywhere. So then he says in the underlined part, V'hinei mivuar b'Rambam. Now this is what I wanted you to see. And I want you to keep this in the other synapse fold of your brain. Sha'anotzrim of the avodah zarahim. Christians are idolaters. It's the same person, okay? Same answerer, same author, on a different question says that the Christians are idolaters. Umemela din kinesiatam kebet avodah zara mamash. Therefore, their church should be exactly like a house of idolatry. V'lachen barur ma'od she'asur levaker b'chnesiat hanotzrim. Therefore, it's extremely clear that you can't go into a church. Okay? So that's what he says. And at the bottom in the notes, he brings up some of the stuff that he mentioned in the other response about, well, maybe they're not, and he just rejects it. Okay, so if you turn to the next page, you'll see in the footnote on the bottom, he says, Ulefi zeh, I put a star next to it even because I was so impressed with how contradictory it is. Ulefi zeh, according to this, לפי מה שנוהגים הנוצרים בכנסייה שתופסים שם דרך אלוהות בקידה והשתחוויה, he says they're bowing and they're prostrating themselves to various images. בוודאי שיש להם דין עובדי עבודה זרה, they definitely have the law of עבודה זרה. He says ודאי. Do you know what the word ודאי means in Hebrew? Definitely, absolutely. So what happens? He forgot what he said. וכדברי הרמב"ם והפוסקים שכתבו שהנוצרים עובדי עבודה זרה הם. Okay, and then he goes on and he brings some other sources that mitigate this a little bit, okay? That mitigate this. But if you turn to the next page in the footnote, he again says, Vanitameh ala gaon asher natakav lehakil benidonel. That he says that no, absolutely it's idolatry. He says absolutely it's idolatry. There's all of these things that he quotes that indicate that maybe it's not actually idolatry. Maybe we can argue that it's softer somehow, that it's only shituf, it's only combining. He says, no, absolutely not. What happened here? Okay, so then he talks about how there was a story that a Jew once owed money to some non-Jew, and the guy came. And it's the other way around. The non-Jew owed the Jew money, and the non-Jew ran into, because they give asylum to you if you run into a church for whatever you did, it doesn't matter. So you run into a church, which by the way always fascinated me, because that the church gives asylum to criminals, because the Torah specifically says in Parashat Mishpatim, it says, Me'im mizbechi tikachenu lamut. That if a murderer goes up on the altar, we take him down and it doesn't matter. And the story of Yoav ben Surya in the Tanakh, that he thinks he's so smart, he jumps onto the altar and says, I'm not going to come down, and you're going to have to kill me here. And Shlomo HaMelech says, okay, kill him there. Right? So we don't think that we think the opposite. It's not that the sanctuary doesn't make a criminal, doesn't redeem the criminal. The opposite. We don't want a criminal in our sanctuary. We don't say it's going to make you better to be in our sanctuary. We don't. So anyway, the guy ran in, and the Jew ran after him to get his money. Unfortunately, we're not going to speak to those stereotypes. And he felt so guilty and distraught over this that he had a whole tikkun. He had to do a whole process of repentance over having stepped into the church for a minute to get the money. Okay, and then he quotes some other stories about people who went into churches, and then the underlined part on the last page, Vagon Rabbi David Zilberstein. He says, Pasak, she'isur knisa l'chnesiya shel notzrim, hu isur Torah. Going even into a church is a biblical prohibition. Even if there was a concern about consequences, it doesn't matter. You're not allowed to go in. And there's a story, it says, Hagaon Rabbi Eliezer Deitch. And I believe this is talking about the Kennedy funeral. I'm not sure. It might be. I'm speculating. I'm not sure about the timing of this. But it says that they once went in. They had a Yom Zikaron. They had a day of remembrance or something for some great non-Jewish person who was invited. The Jewish community was invited to something in a church, and the Jewish people went, and they said absolutely that was wrong, and it's terrible, and it's a terrible thing that they went, and it's wrong. Okay, so he goes on to really condemn it. Now that he's quoting somebody else. In other words, this situation happened, and they went in and they asked, did we do something wrong? He said, absolutely, it's a terrible sin, and you need to do teshuvah. And then the sikum at the bottom, he summarizes that absolutely not should they go, and that the tour guides that are Jewish should not bring the Jewish people who are visiting into the churches. Okay, so that's his conclusion. He says, absolutely not. It's absolutely idolatry. Now wait a second. That should confuse those of us who are keeping score with the place that we started, because up till now he's been saying that, well, maybe we can find a way to mitigate, and it's not really idolatry, and it should be okay.
No, but what is
okay? How so? But he's not really right.
You're talking about?
Well, no, because we're talking just about praying, so he's not necessarily actually saving a life. Saving a life, we would have to do anyway. For other reasons.
I thought this was about the doctor could heal a Gentile.
That's how we started. That's the basic source. So then the basic source is healing. So, but then he's riffing off of that to praying. Are you allowed to pray? Because this convert is saying, can I pray for my non-Jewish relative? He might be a devout Catholic or something. Oh, can I?
Heal, in other words, but again, okay, so using that's to heal, to save a life.
Right, it's a type of healing.
It's the very big difference than going into a building where they're...
That's true. No, I agree with you. I think that's part of the beauty of it here. In other words, when it comes to something which is just a matter of you're going on a tour or something, and we don't need to find a room to maneuver.
Exceptions.
Right. But in a case where you're dealing, and I don't think it's just because of the saving of the life. I think it's something more than that. Because, and we're going to see as he develops it even further. I think that there's something really remarkable about this responsum that I've never seen in any other responsum by Hakham Ovadiah before, which is that it tells you who wrote the question. He never mentions who wrote the question before. Now, in many other responsa, in like Yabia Omer, and some other responsa, like Rav Moshe Weinstein's responsa, he always writes who wrote him the question. Rav Ovadiah never does, but he says, She'ela miger tzedek. Right? I got this question from a convert. So, in other words, he tells you where he got the question, and I think that part of that is explaining to you, he understands how this person feels. Right? This is the person's family. This is the person's relative. It's not an impersonal question of can I go into a certain building, okay, for something that I can opt out of. It's a matter of your father is on his deathbed, your mother is sick, your brother, your sister, and the Ger Tzedek, a person who entered into the Jewish faith, trying to connect to the Jewish people, trying to connect to God, and now you're telling them you can't pray for your relative that you love.
He's
okay.
That on the one hand,
right. So when you're dealing with a human being and their emotions, it's not just about saving the person's life, which is obviously in God's hands, but it's about this Ger Tzedek, this convert who came to the Jewish people for something positive, and you're saying to them, you know what? Don't pray for him. He's an idolater. We don't want. That's not the way that we want to approach this. When we're dealing with real human interactions, we look for leniency. When we're dealing with making it easier for a convert to be able to stay connected to their family and to be able to not feel alienated from who they are, we look for leniency. We toy with opinions that maybe in other cases we would just say, no, definitely not. That's definitely wrong. We reject it. But here we entertain it for a while because we're looking for a way to make it more comfortable. Yes?
So is he treating a convert differently than someone who is born as the Jewish? Because there are different problems that a convert brings to the table in terms of Christian relatives and being able to go to the funeral of your mother or your father.
Right.
It's a very challenging.
It's a big.
Well, is he basically saying there are different rules for converts?
He never says the idea that this rule only applies to a convert. We're going to see. We're going to see how he develops it even further. But I think that the fact that we're talking about human relationships and compassion between people and consideration for human beings changes the tone and the approach, so that he is seeking to find as many reasons to allow this. In other words, you can feel it. You can feel he's seeking to discover as many reasons to open up the door and to make it easier for this convert as he can. That doesn't mean that he doesn't think his line of argument is legitimate. Of course, he's not going to give them something that is not true. He believes that but he's opening up more options and more bases for leniency than he might normally open, because he wants to give as much of a basis as possible to this convert to be able to have what they need. Yes?
But I haven't gone any further in this, and you're saying there's much more. I haven't read it.
Yeah, there's more. We're going to go further.
But in the end, does he lay down, or does anybody lay down whether the convert should do his mourning in the shul or the church?
We'll see what he says. We'll see. He's going to get to saying kaddish, actually. That's what he's going to say. Yeah.
You have a situation all the time of someone who comes to shul and he had a neighbor that
died or was getting married. Oh, wants to be not Jewish.
So now you have a situation. What is the balkore or whatever?
Okay, he's going to talk about that exact situation. So let's hold on to that, because I'll let him speak for himself. Okay, he's going to talk about that. So what we have, though, is I think it's so important, is that this is typical of one of the characteristics of Hakham Ovadiah that was spoken about in pretty much every eulogy and every one of the hespedim, which was that he was a master of halacha. He knew all the sources. He knew how to use the sources. He knew how to draw from literally tens of thousands, if not more than that, hundreds of thousands of sources at his fingertips, better than a computer. And yet, he still answered not just the question, he answered, as they say, the sho'el, not just the she'elah. He answered the person who was asking. In other words, he looked at the situation and he understood it, not just as an abstract halachic question, which it's easy to say no in the abstract halachic question. Oh, so should I say kaddish for my relative who's not Jewish? Of course not. What? But that's not the way that he's approaching it. He's approaching it as a human question that's much more complicated, and he's trying to find ways to enfranchise a person. And that was the way that he was. You see his personality very prominently behind this teshuvah, and that's why I like it so much. So he goes on, and we're going to see some of these other questions are raised tangentially. So now he says, "V'chen b'kodesh chaziteh." He says, we're going back to the first one. We're going back to the page, second page, front of second page, last paragraph. So he says, "I've seen Rabbi Yitzchak Atiyah b'Sefer Rov Dagan." In a book called Rov Dagan by Rabbi Yitzchak Atiyah, he says, "Shenishal," he was asked, "Im mutar lilchosh ulitpalel al goy cholesh yitrapeh." Can you pray for a non-Jew, just in general? Forget about it. You don't have to be related to them. And he says, "Ve'eshiv she'im hu biyod'o mekiro shu mechasidei umot ha'olam v'shomer sheva mitzvot shel bnei Noach pashut me'od." Now, if this person is a righteous Gentile who's a Noachite and he follows the 7 commandments of Noach, for sure, no question. Of course you can. He's not sure. He doesn't know what a tzaddik is. Yitpalel alav. Here's the solution. Yitpalel alav sheyachzor lemutav v'yitrapeh. Fine. So pray that this non-Jew should be worthy of God's compassion. Whatever that means. Pray that he be inspired to come close to God so he will be worthy. If he's a bad guy, in whatever way, whatever that means, pray for him to be helped. Okay, so it says, like in the story of Bruria. So he doesn't explain what that story of Bruria is. The story of Bruria is that Rabbi Meir was having some not that story that you're thinking of. No. The story of Bruria that he's thinking of is that Rabbi Meir had some neighbors who were bothering him, and he wanted to pray, and they were bad guys. So he was like praying that they should die. And Bruria came and said, no, it says, Yitamu Chatta'im Min ha'aretz. It says, sins should leave, not Chotta'im, not the sinner. Right? So she said, you should pray that they do teshuvah, become better. And they did, and it was a happily ever after. So the point is, you can pray, if a person is in a situation that maybe you know that they're not such a good guy. This could happen Jew or non-Jew, it doesn't matter. Let's say you know somebody that you like them, but you know that they're not the best of people. They could use some work. So you pray to God that they should be worthy in God's eyes. That God should help them to improve themselves, they'd be worthy. You can do that. Now, look at what he says in the last line. Here's really remarkable. So far, he's opening the door, and he keeps opening the door. He opened the door first by saying maybe Christianity is not idolatry. That was an iffy thing, because we know that in other places, behechlet, he says absolutely it is. Right? So that was already a small door. Now, he opened a bigger door and said, well, you're really not helping him. You're really just praying to God. Now he says, pray to God, not to help him, because maybe that's presumptuous, because maybe he's not so good. Pray to God to help him be worthy of God's mercy. That you certainly could do. Now he's quoting somebody else who says this, by the way, another Sephardic authority. Okay? Now, and what does that authority also say? He takes it to the next level. Not only can you should. Oh wow, now it's a mitzvah to do it. Why? Because he says, mitzvah litpalel lehem mipnei darchei shalom. Because it promotes peace amongst people when you pray for one another. People know that you're praying for them. It's a nice thing to do. And if this non-Jew knows that you, the Jew, went and prayed for him and then he gets better, wow. He's going to say, God is great, right? Look at that. Right? Wow. Right, Allahu Akbar. Right? Look at how great God is. Maybe he won't say that. Right, not those words, maybe. But other words, depending on what language he speaks, he'll say, wow, this God of the Jews really came through for me. What's the story of that we see? The story of Elisha. The story of Elisha in the Tanakh. Right, where Elisha tells Naaman, the general of Aram, go into the Yarden. He says, what kind of, aren't you going to wave a wand over me? And he says, no, just go on. So he goes, and of course he's healed, and he says, wow, your God is the real God, and I'm never going to worship any idolatry again, and da-da-da-da-da-da. So the point is, when you do something and you show the power of God, that's a wonderful thing. So not only are you allowed to, because he says, no, it's great, you should do it. It's a mitzvah. That's what Rav Atiyah says, that Hakham Ovadiah now is quoting him. So he says, who knows, maybe he'll become a Jew. Not that that's required, but, maybe he will. Right, Rav Achai, Rav Gadol. So he talks about a story where, the story of Elisha and so on. And he says, "V'kol sheken bazman hazeh she'anu begalot utzrichim anu lahem." He says, not only that, but we're in the diaspora. We need them. Now, I don't think that he means that in a utilitarian way. What he means to say is, we're all in the one boat together. It's not like it's an we're all helping each other. We're all part of one society. We're all part of one community. We don't live in a purely Jewish neighborhood. Our friends are not Jewish. Our associates are not Jewish. People that we rely on are not Jewish all the time. And of course, so we're all, our fates are bound up with one another. It's not simply a matter of, they are on their own and we're on our own. It's not like that. We all have a common destiny together when we live in the diaspora, and we have this kinship. So he says that's another reason why we should do it. And he talks about a story about where somebody brought a baby to the rabbi. The rabbi blessed the baby, and it was a huge Kiddush Hashem because the baby healed after that. Now, that's not guaranteed, obviously, but it could be good. So, and then he talks about, again, Rav Atiyah, he's quoting, brings the point about how this whole issue of not helping the idolaters is only real idolaters. Today, they're just doing the minhag of their parents. They don't know what's Christianity, they don't know anything about their religion, really. They're just following through the motions. Okay, and then he says, Ad kan dato, and then he brings other stories about helping out non-Jews in cases where God healed the non-Jew. And it was a big Kiddush Hashem. It was a very positive thing. And now if you jump down, now he goes back to, like around where I have the underlining, but like 2 lines above that. So this is just a general thing so far. So far we had Christianity, well, maybe we can have some leeway, not so good, but we'll try. Second, we're really addressing God. And we're addressing God indirectly. We're saying, make him worthy. Right? Now we're saying, no, maybe even it's a mitzvah to do it, because if it works out, they'll see that Hashem is great. Now he says this. Now he takes it even further. And this is the human side again. This is something that you won't find in many responsa of Haredi Jews. I promise you that. He says, it's really proper for the convert to pray for his father. Why? Because Rashai lasot ken. It's also a mitzvah. Why? Because this person brought him into the world. It's not his parents. This person birthed them, brought them into the world, raised them. That's a phrase from the Talmud, until he became independent. Chai noseh et atzmo means a living person carries himself, meaning he's able to walk around. How did this Gentile, how was he able to become a Jew? How was he able to do anything that he did? It was because his parents raised him and gave him the ability to make his own decisions, or her own decisions. So there's a sense of hakarat hatov. Even though it's true. Now here he gets even deeper into this. Because normally, halachically, what do we say? Halachically, ger shenitgayer. A convert that becomes Jewish, it's like they're reborn. Reborn. They're not part of their previous family anymore. Okay? Now there are certain restrictions, but pretty much they're not part of their previous family anymore. We say, well, they can't marry their sister or something like that because it looks like they went to a lower level of holiness than they were before. Because even under the Noahide law, they can't do that. But the point is that they're new. They don't have any connection. He says, that's true, but there are two ways that a convert keeps the connection. Number one, that if, let's say, somebody converted and their parents also became Jewish, so even though they're actually not considered related, which is really unusual, in other words, halachically, each one of them is totally newly born. But still, the parents are considered to have fulfilled the mitzvah of having children. Because their children converted and they're Jewish. So did this person have Jewish children? Yes. When they were born, they weren't Jewish, but now he has Jewish children, so he's good. Okay? So it works. Final analysis, final computation, it's good. So he says, so that's a connection, and it says asur lekalel avivimo. It's one of the 613 mitzvot is you're not allowed to curse your parents. So the convert will say, "You're not my parents. I don't know you anything. You're nobody to me. I converted. I'm newly born. I'm not related to you." So it says, no, they can't do that. Why? Because what will the people? They'll say, that's what a Jew does. A Jew curses their parents. They're not going to be thinking in halachic terms. They're going to say, before that you wouldn't curse me, now you curse me to my face. I mean, that's what Judaism teaches you? That's terrible. So, therefore, we see, though, that there's some connection still. That's what he's saying. Now, this is a tenuous connection, if I've ever heard one. Okay? What is the connection? That technically they're considered his children for the purposes of that he fulfilled the mitzvah of having children. Okay. And they're not allowed to curse they're not allowed to curse their parents. Okay, that's very nice. That's a connection? Okay. Not quite. In all other halachic respects, they're not really viewed as having a relationship. They're newly born. Yet, he says, nonetheless, this shows you that it's proper for the convert to pray for his parents to be healed. And we turn to the next page. He quotes further that he quotes further some back and forth, but at the underlined part where it says Shin Hey on top, he says Ve'od shafilu nomar sha'asur lerapotam mikol makom lehitpalil avuram mutar. That even in the worst case scenario, that you were to determine that they're absolute idolaters and all the rules of idolatry applied to them, which we already said there's some wiggle room on that for many reasons. Still, you could pray. Why? Ki Hashem yitbarach yodea kol masei adam u'machshevotav. That is up to God. You talk to God, God will handle it. V'chol raz lo anisle, and He knows all the details. He's the one who's going to make the decision, and so on and so forth. Now jump all the way down to where I underlined, then I put a star next to it. V'chol sheken benidon didan. I like how he says this. This is amazing, and you won't find, these are his words, these are Hakham Ovadiah's words. You won't find this kind of reasoning in any responsum of any rabbi that I've ever seen. He says, V'kol sheken benidon didan. Okay? That he talks about many cases where you're allowed to pray for, you're allowed to pray for them because you're addressing God, and so on. For all the reasons we said. Because his father brought him into the world. That's it. You're not allowed to be ungrateful for what your parents did. And even if the parent himself is not Jewish, it doesn't matter. Why are you Jewish? Because your parents brought you into this world. You wouldn't be here to be anything if your parents didn't bring you into the world. You wouldn't have had the tools that you had to make the choice that you did to become Jewish. So therefore, your parents, even though they might not have been Jewish, indirectly made it possible for you to be Jewish. Because they put you into the world, they gave you the tools that you needed, they made you independent, they fed you and clothed you, they educated you, they did everything for you. How can you now turn around and say, you're not my parents and I don't care about you and you might as well die? Because you're an idolater. How could it be? So that kind of reasoning is what I would call not halachic reasoning so much. That's not legal reasoning so much. That is philosophical reasoning. In other words, he's saying to you, it's permitted, and if it's permitted, then ethically, morally, you have to do it. How can you not do it? Right? It's a moral obligation. And now he says this. Now he gets to kaddish. That's a quote from Paro, what Paro says to Yosef. Right? Now that God has made known to you all of this, he says, now that God has made known to us all of this, meaning now that we've established beyond reasonable doubt that it is not only allowed, but even you should pray for your parents or your relatives because of all these reasons. He says, it could be the mother too. He's just using father as an example. After the death, it's proper that he say kaddish for them. Now, I looked around and I saw people saying, absolutely not. How could you say kaddish for a non-Jew? What is this? He says, so I saw some people saying, well, Hakham Ovadiah said you could, so in really bad circumstance you can rely on it or something like that. And he says, but Ovadiah says, no, you should do it. Why? Because, now if we turn to the next page. So he says, what's the reason? Again, he brings in the same reasoning. Kevan shehu holido vehevi'o lechayei ha'olam hazeh. This person brought him into the world. And whether the parent knew it or not, indirectly or directly brought the child to become who he is today, whatever he is today. Then he should not only pray for him in this world, he should pray for him in the next world. Because if he's allowed to pray for him in this world, that he should be healed, then certainly if he's in the next world, we know that the kaddish is understood in Kabbalah as being something which is that's ilui nishmat niftar, that raises the soul. That's a Kabbalistic teaching. Some people don't subscribe to it, some people do. But the theory behind saying kaddish for a loved one, part of the idea is ilui nishama. So if you're going to now, some people understand it not as a metaphysical thing, but as a kavod thing, as an honor. But still, however you slice it, certainly if it's about elevating the soul, this person elevated you in your life. How can you not elevate them? Not only in this world, in the next world, you should also do it. Yes?
Can I ask a side question?
Sure.
Something is raised in my mind here. How much teaching do we know a convert was given to become a Jew in those times? Because we have 10 commandments, honor your father and your mother. So I would think that stood before anything else.
Right, of course. But the whole thing is, what he's saying is that from a technical halachic standpoint, when a person becomes a Jew, they are reborn. It's like they never had any family. It's like they just were born today. So that's from a halachic standpoint. Yes. So therefore they don't So really legally, they don't have the obligation. So what we say to them is, you need to respect your parents. Why? Okay, legally you can argue, well, I'm not related to them anymore. But it's not proper, because they're going to see this and say, as a non-Jew, you respected me. Now you become supposedly you're on a higher level. You're a Jew now, and now you disrespect me. What kind of a religion is this, right? So that's the problem. But so he says, though, even kaddish, after they leave the world, and he goes into a discussion of this idea that the kaddish elevates the soul. And then if you skip down to where I underlined, he says, "Vehen emet שראיתי בספר חסידים שכתב וגר מבקש על אביו ואמו לא יועיל להקל מדינם." So he quotes what would seem to be a very negative line from a sefer called Sefer Hasidim that says a convert who prays for his parents is not going to help them. So, in other words, in the next, it's not going to help them. So he's quoting from an Ashkenazi writing that says that. So it sounds very negative. So he says to himself, how can I spin this one? So he says, what he means is that the child halachically doesn't really have the parent-child relationship according to halacha. But it still will be good. So he just pushes it aside. He says, he just meant it's not the same as a child doing it. He didn't mean it's not going to help at all. He means it's not the same as a child doing it because he's not really considered his child halachically anymore. He's a new creation. He's a child of Abraham now. Okay? So he's just like a stranger doing it, but it's still good because if somebody says kaddish for you, if you don't have children, then you have somebody else say kaddish for you. It also helps. So it's the same thing. So then he says something even further. He says, and if you're going to tell me that this interpretation is forced, that really this Sefer Hasidim meant, no, it's absolutely worthless, he says, no, it's not true. Because the Sefer Hasidim himself says, that if a non-Jew has done good for the Jewish people, they should pray for him. Of course, how can you not show great gratitude? Okay, Sheyakil benino, that God should be good to him, not only in this world, but even in the next world. So you see that, and if you jump down to the next place where I underlined, ubenidon didan en lecha tova gdola mizo shehevi ola olam hazeh kadei sheyizkeh l'chayim haba ubevadai ru'ui v'nachon shomar alav kaddish. So the unbelievable things, he keeps going, he repeats this mantra 3 or 4 times in the Responsa. He keeps saying, these people brought you into the world. Whatever you are, it's because of them. How can you not say? How can you not pray for them in this world? How can you not pray for them when they're in the next world? It doesn't make sense. If for someone who did good for you in a tangential way, somebody outside did something good for you, you would have to show gratitude. Otherwise, you would feel ungrateful. How can you not do the same for your parents? And if you turn to the last page, he quotes there's one last piece to the approach. He says, "Vehenatara iti lahagaon Rabbi Aharon Walkin." This was an Ashkenazic teshuva, contemporary also. B'shelot teshuvot zekan Aharon shishavli don didan v'tzided gam ken shoshei lomar kaddish. So basically, he said, yes, he can say kaddish. However, he said, then he says, he says, there's no obligation. And then he went back on it and said, people will be confused. They'll say, well, we know this guy wasn't really Jewish before, now he's Jewish, who's he saying kaddish for? Right, so they're going to be confused. So yeah, you shouldn't do it. But then he says, aval didan, but for us, Hakham Ovadiah says, forget about this responsa, because for us, she'akol omrim kaddish bi'achad. Everybody says, you have 10 people on the back saying kaddish. You could have 25 people. He says, nobody's looking. He's not taking away, because, in the old days, they used to have the Ashkenazim. The Sfaradim never had this. In the old days, Ashkenazim used to have that only one person said kaddish. Only one person. And there's a whole list in the Sfarim, there's a whole list of the priority for kaddish. Oh, is it your father? Is it the first week? Is it the first month? Is it the yahrzeit? Only one person was allowed to say kaddish at a time. So you got the zechut to say it if you were lucky enough to be the one that was highest on. But there's like 15 different levels of entitlement to say the kaddish yatom, the mourner's kaddish. But only one person. In the Sephardic lands, it was always that everybody said it. And so you see responsa from the, considered modern responsa, meaning that they were not rishonim, not medieval responsa, but later responsa, that say, what's called the time of the Achronim, that argue that, well, we should follow the Sfaradim. That's how the custom came. Originally the Sfaradim did that, and the Ashkenazim said we should follow the Sfaradim, that instead of having fights, because they used to have fights break out. No, I want to say kaddish. No, I want to, because could you imagine? So they said we should follow we have fights about lesser things. So the Sfaradim, they said we should follow them, and everybody say kaddish who's saying kaddish. And nowadays that's pretty much almost everywhere, but not everywhere, but almost everywhere. That's how it's done. So, right, there are still some old school. Right, there are still old school Ashkenazim who do the one at a time, but one person saying kaddish. But in general, the common practice is for everyone. So he says, therefore, since ve'eno pogeh b'zchutam shel acherim, you're not taking away from anybody else to say the kaddish. You're not hurting anybody. Everyone just jumps in and says kaddish for whoever they want. Right? So therefore, nira li baror she'en limnoa me'ager tzedek lomar hashkava. Did you hear that? Hashkava v'kaddish. That's even more. Hashkava is the prayer that's like il malei rachamim.
Right.
Okay? We do differently. We do tov shem yishem and tov. We have a different language of it, but it's the same thing. Hashkava. He says Hashkava v'kaddish le'ilui nishmato shel aviv. V'Hashem lo yimna tov lo lochim betamim. And Hashem won't withhold any good from somebody who's doing things with a pure heart. Okay? And then he says, and it's even better to learn Torah for the merit of the person who passed away. And that's an even higher thing. So that's how he concludes. So he says at the end, it says, Besikum ger tzedek rashai leitpalel l'refuat aviv anochri b'cholio, that a convert is perfectly permitted to do so. V'gam rashai lomar kaddish alav lachar petirato li'iloi nishmato v'adin le'ema ger tzedek, that he's permitted and even encouraged, according to this. It seems very strongly encouraged to pray for his parents, both while they're alive and even after they pass away. And even to say hashkava, because kaddish, you could say, well, kaddish is different because kaddish is generic. You don't mention any names in kaddish. Kaddish is a praising of God.
Yes, but it's very Jewish.
Right, it's very Jewish, but the kaddish is generic. So in other words, I say kaddish, you say kaddish, we're all saying the same thing. You don't know, I could be saying kaddish for my pet turtle that died. You don't know, it could be anybody. Right? It could be my uncle, my grandparent, anybody could be for kaddish. It's generic. We all say the same words. Hashkava, you say, what's the name?
What's the name, by the way?
Right?
What would you say?
So you would say their English name, or whatever language. You would say just their name.
It's talking about the regular Mishaberach.
Mishaberach if they're sick, or El Malei Rachamim if they passed away, and saying their name So in other words, it's even specific. Their name could be, John Christensen. It doesn't matter. You could say it in the Mishaberach. You could say it in the Hashkava. So he says it doesn't matter who they are. You can say these prayers. So what I found fascinating about the tshuva is many things, but two things in particular. First of all, how in two different contexts his emphasis is so different, because in one context he's dealing, like you said, with something which is an abstract question and something which can be avoided, which is to go into a building you don't need to go into. We can be strict about what we define as idolatry. But when it comes to something where it's a human issue, we seek leniency, and he keeps opening doors. Some of the doors are wider and can fit more through, and some of them are a little narrower. But he opens as many doors as possible, and he builds a case. Then, once he has the ground leveled, in other words, once he got rid of all the prohibitions that one could raise, all the objections that one could raise, he does a different assault. Right? He does a proactive. He doesn't just clear the field of minds, okay? He doesn't just take away the objections. Then he says, you should do it, because how can you not do it? And it's proper to do it, and there's so many reasons, because it sanctifies God's name, and because of the sense of gratitude. So it's not only halachic reasoning, but it's also a moral sense, and a humanistic sense, and a universalistic sense that this is your parent, this is your family member that you love, and that had an influence on your life, and how can you discount that because of technicalities of halakha? So he clears away the technicalities of halakha to make room for what seems to me to be a very clear moral imperative that's pulsing through the entire responsa. Yes?